Howdy, y'all, and welcome back to the Cool Zone. This is the first episode I'm recording on Audacity, so I can actually have breaks and have some little flubs, mess up a little bit. Um, I apologize for the lack of uploads last week. A friend came into town, so I had to go be with them. That was a very enjoyable break for me, actually, and let me reflect on some of the ideas that I have going on in the pod. I was planning episode regarding the placement of LGBTQ plus peoples and identities within any real socialist movement and the great history of riots and of violent revolution in finding rights for these groups. But recent events and continuing situations here in the cool zone have given me a bit of a different idea for today's topic. Going forward, my plans are to do one half-hour episode like this each week, and then an hour-long episode later in the week. And the difference between those two is the initial bit, that half-hour episode, will try to focus on more basic theory, more basic ideas in critical thought, in the social sciences and in economics. And then that hour-long episode will dive into more discussion from me. Recent events have reminded me that the media and its infantile control by the state are a sore subject for Western liberals. If we consider the world today, and if we consider the world of these most recent centuries, the 20th and 21st, we see quite clearly that there has not been, to my knowledge, a real state that didn't control its media in one way or another. We have this idea in America of freedom of press. There's something to be said for this First Amendment right, so called, that says that you will not be oppressed for reporting on the things that happen in the world around you. And yet, we see that the media itself is upheld by a certain state institution, which is to say its hegemony, right? We see that, and this is going to be a bit from Gramsci almost, but it's the idea that the state can influence society and can influence what society chooses to accept as normal and as okay. And the state can also suppress what is abnormal and what is not okay. And one example of this is during the McCarthy eras, many prominent socialists, communists, queer people, Pan-Africanists, black and brown folks of all different strides, and white folks and Jews as well, were, brought before Congress and berated and yelled at and infantilized and attacked, often on live TV. And this created a culture that, going forward, we had the Cold War, where we have regarded as even, now, ever since then, really, the ideas of socialism, the ideas of mass social liberation, the ideas of mass social unity, the ideas of a vanguard party, all of these things have been derided carefully in modern Western culture. Very carefully has it been seen and noted, and certainly America, that things like the Communist Party of the USA, which did suck, have been destroyed over time. There is no more basis for this speech and for this attitude and agitation for it. Which does not meet the idea that we have free speech at all, because true free speech is not simply the ability to say something, but it is the ability to say it and be heard. Free speech is meaningless in a void. Free speech is meaningless in a forest. If a tree falls alone in a forest and no one is around to hear it, how can we know that it fell? And if you say something and there is no one around listening, then how can we know that that happened? The way that the state controls the media today is through funding. Yes, through shadow funding, I would say. But it's also, more importantly, through what it can and cannot tell the media and how the media chooses to portray things. Looking at CNN, we see no fewer than 2 of its current correspondents are former CIA agents or formerly worked for members of the American intelligentsia, members of the American intelligence apparatus around the world, be that the CIA, be that naval intelligence, even be that the FBI. This is rather quite problematic because regardless of what you think of those organizations, the fact that former members of them, so-called former members, have the ability to go out on national television and decide what is said and decide how it is being said gives them some measure of control. There is no proof that these are merely former workplaces. There is no proof that the ideas that these workplaces and these organizations press are no longer empowered. There is no proof that these people do not ultimately function as agents of these organizations. But this alone is not the issue. The greater issue of the state in controlling narratives today is how the news is broken about things. And what do I mean by that? When we first saw these riots rise up a few weeks ago, we saw this idea that, for that first Friday night, the media was very surprised, right? They were like, why are they burning this precinct? Why'd the AutoZone go up in flames? Why? And the reasoning behind all of this largely was in some cases, outside agitators. The AutoZone was outside agitators. However, things like the Target, things like that first police precinct, were not. They were done by people from within these places. In fact, the discussion of outside agitators has been historically used to denigrate such riots as racially motivated, as destructive to one's own property and to the place where these people are from and to their communities, and has been used to attack and to base attacks on protests. The issue of outside agitators is quite simply that there are none. They do not exist. The liberal media today, as well as, Fox, but I would consider them neoliberal, so that's a form of liberalism, would argue that, from their perspective, white so-called professional anarchists, whatever that is, I wish I could be one of those, have been destroying black-owned businesses and community centers within these places where we are seeing riots. Now, there's a lot wrong with that. Namely, that there are no professional anarchists. If there were, surely I would have gotten that call by now. That often these places which are being destroyed, such as the Target, destroyed many local businesses and were in fact objects of great hate and distrust for the communities. People love to forget that Target in Minneapolis comes from Target HQ deciding, which it itself is based in another part of Minneapolis, to put that one there in a black community to test new security functions. That Target had special security apparatus in it, special cameras, special detectors that scared a lot of the locals, and the locals did not like that Target, and who can blame them? The Target always treated them as though they were stealing, and they weren't. There was no basis for this. In addition, the Target put a locally owned black grocery and a number of other smaller locally owned stores out of business when it showed up and offered, highly commodified, low-priced things. Now, I do hear the argument that there is no ethical consumption under capitalism. I would certainly agree. I would say that there is no way for us to use the means of our oppressor to ever beat them. However, this idea that it matters to a community to have that Target is nonsense. This idea that the community cannot function without these stores is nonsense. Community in America has long since been destroyed, atomized, as it were, by the mixed oppressions of American individualism, American Protestantism, American capital, and American prosperity gospel. I will get into some of these in another episode. The issue of community in America comes largely from the fact that we cannot be communal if we must rely entirely on ourselves. One of the biggest ideas of socialism that I want to impress upon you, the listener, today is that of empathy. The socialist is the most empathetic person I can think of because the socialist recognizes that only when all the proletarians, all the workers, all the people who must labor to create wealth are unified under solidarity, overcoming boundaries such as race, such as gender, such as sexuality, can there be power for them, right? Only when they unify against the odds of the capitalist class and against the capitalist class can the workers of the world find power and overcome oppression. It is the duty of the capitalist class, therefore, to prevent you from unifying. This is the duty of the managerial class, who we see come in and run things such as, you guessed it, the large media, and the media in general. I wouldn't even have to say the large necessarily. And who runs, our newspapers, who runs our television shows, who runs Hollywood. These people's job, ultimately, is to impress upon us boundaries and atomization functions and features, edges, if you would, to our world that do not exist as part of the material function, that do not exist as part of the ways in which we live, where we live, how we live, why we live, what we do for our living. No, these boundaries which they would impress upon us come ultimately only from themselves. They are complete fabrications. Race, a complete fabrication. Gender, the first fabrication. Modern sexuality insofar as, putting words to it, making it a label, making it something to be ashamed of. Boundaries, if you would. Now, there is a difference between these bourgeois boundaries, which were placed upon the proletariat by the bourgeois class, by the controlling class, and proletarian boundaries, which were created by the proletarians themselves. One example would be exonyms and endonyms for a region, right? Originally, we see something like China come up as an exonym that was given upon the Hanese and upon the people who live in modern-day China by their English colonizers. Typically, names such as very Latinized names in English are typically exonyms given by colonizers. What a nation is, what a proletarian nation is, on the other hand, is how the proletarian, how the working class of that region have created a culture for themselves, of themselves, and by themselves. This is very different, and this must always be respected, right? So an example of this is we see, if we look at the New York ballroom shows, back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, they were a major part of queer culture in New York. We see many transgender, at that time referred to as transsexual, women and men of black and brown communities come together to dance together, to show off together, to emulate in many ways the white life that they could not themselves have, and also to create a new culture for themselves. Now, perhaps the emulation of whiteness was something cast upon them, something that they felt that they needed to do. But that culture in and of itself was theirs. That's a very proletarian, that's a very nationalistic culture to have, and that's a good thing. Nationalism, when done properly, as an empathetic tool, as a way to preserve one's culture, as a way to preserve one's dignity within the larger world, good thing. Nationalism, when used in the bourgeois sense, as a weapon of war, as something to exclude someone else, as something to mark boundaries in the world, very different. Very, very much worse so. Um, and so, what we see really here is that the nations in America have shifted. Originally, we see a very broad sense of nationality in this country, right? We see that whiteness, really, in America was reserved first just for Brits. The British settlers did not consider the Dutch settlers in modern day New York to be their equals. They did not consider the French settlers to be their equals either. The only people who were considered white, the only people who were considered of the top class at that time would have been English speaking people from England. Similarly, we look at Spaniards and how they colonized, and there are many different castes, there are many different racially based castes in their system. Same idea. However, these change, right? These nation borders change over time as a group gains propriety and gains power within a region. Whiteness comes to be a thing really in the 1960s and 1970s when blackness becomes a larger issue. Here in America, for a very long time, to be Italian, to be Polish, to be Irish, to be Catholic was looked down upon. They were the most downtrodden of what we would consider today's whites. They were, in many cases, oppressed to the same extent as their black counterparts. However, they could adopt whiteness later on because they found a way, through the accumulation of capital, through becoming similar in many ways culturally to the WASPs, to ingratiate themselves, to make themselves part of the society at large. Now, one group that never really managed to do this would be the Southerner, the Southern white. Not the Southern aristocracy. No, the Southern aristocracy today are lauded largely. Look at the fetishization of the Confederacy today. No, the Southerner in Appalachia, the moonshiner, was never really accepted. It is still derided today by liberals and conservatives alike as being dumb, as being ignorant, as not understanding the world at large, as driving big dumb trucks and doing dumb things. But back a long time ago, these people, of course, were the first bootleggers. These people hated cops. These people hated the rich in much the same way, I would argue, as blacks did, and always probably will insofar as we have capital. What I'm saying is, these were the original nation boundaries, right? Race, culture, religion. And in many ways, they still are aesthetic boundaries. In many ways, these nations exist today in an aesthetic sense. However, their function as communities, as bringing together points, as one of the few cruxes upon which we can meet up in a modern American sense, has changed. And it has changed along class lines, just as Marx predicted it always would, just as any material analysis would have told you it would. What happened? Their material conditions changed. These people became like one another. These people shared jobs. These people shared neighborhoods. These people shared community centers. No longer was there a grocery just for the Jews, just for the Catholics, just for the Protestants. Now they all shop at Kroger. No longer were there white neighborhoods, and German neighborhoods, Jewish ghettos often, Italian neighborhoods. Now they can all live together so long as they agree on the basic fact that they must be oppressing the black man. That now, more importantly, that they must be oppressing the proletarian. And where do we see this? We see this in gentrification. Many gentrified areas contain just as many poor whites as they do poor blacks, poor Latinos, poor Native Americans, poor foreigners who have moved here to this country, poor recent immigrants. But all of these people are treated as the same when the law comes and busts someone's squat, when they are homeless, when they cannot become employed. All of these show the same ultimate boundaries. The fact that the issue was never their race, their creed, their color. The issue was always in their material conditions, in their jobs or lack thereof, in how they lived and where they lived. And that's the issue, isn't it? That's the real dividing factor in modern America, is your class. Ultimately, it was always class. I can show you, perhaps another time, how all of these nationalities were always derided differently and always treated differently, not at all due to how they acted, what they ate, what they said, where they went on Sunday or Saturday or Friday. None of that ultimately mattered. It was their class, it was their position in society with money. I'll show you more examples of that another time. But with these recent protests and with this outrage from the liberal whites, I wanted to say this. The struggle is not and has never been about race, nor ethnicity, nor color, nor gender, nor creed. The struggle is in class. The struggle has always been class-based. The struggle will always be class-based. Historically, let's look back. Back through the 1700s here in America, we have seen officials imposing taxes on liquor sales. Farmers and immigrants from the beginning of this country have had to create liquor for themselves to sell to make extra money, or just to drink often because you could not buy it if you were poor. This goes back to the odd morality that America has, which we will discuss perhaps later this week. You see, the issue is that to sell this liquor, often they had to do what is called bootleg it. They had to get a car that looked quote-unquote stock, normal enough to avoid attention, but that could drive much faster, that had much more heavy-duty shocks, and that had better brakes and better turning ability than the police, so that they could outmaneuver them. These early poor whites in their stock cars would eventually race these cars in what was called stock car racing, which is how we get modern-day NASCAR. It is therefore interesting to me that it is these same poor whites who often had to protect the Institute of the Police. It is therefore interesting to me that it is often Southern whites who come most to the defense of the police. And this comes in the function of police in race as opposed to class, and how ultimately today the dividing line in these riots is not at all about race, but it is about class and everything. So what are we looking at in here? Well, we have to analyze the change in material conditions and why they changed. For a lot of these minority communities, Appalachian whites, Italians, Irish, Polish, the police were always a great danger. However, the police also offered them one of their greatest opportunities in many cases. We see the same cultural prevalence today in the military. What I mean to say is, often the job in the police was one of few very high-paying, very well-regarded jobs available to them. It was not until recently, within the 20th century, that the police came to such prominence with the growth of urban areas and with the need to cleanse them often. You see, the issue became that the WASPs, and by that I do mean white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, could not be trusted in large part to govern themselves according to their governors, who were themselves WASPs. The issue became that there were growing ghettos of Jews, of blacks, Italians, Polish, Irish, and that the easiest way to govern these ghettos was, just as is the easiest way to govern a plantation, to appoint from within instead of from without, so that the person who was overseeing them, so that the person who was governing them, so that the person who was managing them was one of their own, was one that they might trust more, the Uncle Tom of the group. And so the police rise to prominence as a very respected position within these communities because he was seen as bringing a measure of safety, a measure of peace, that did not exist earlier in the eyes of the foreigner, in the eyes of the colonizer, but that certainly existed within these communities, right? Clearly, no one is living in a dangerous shithole. Clearly, people are governing themselves fine. But to the eyes of the governing officials, anything less than their involvement can never be enough. And so we see here these people, these police from within, rising up as a position of power and a position of money-making and a position of authority within these communities that was often rather revered, rather enjoyed. for good reason, I'm sure. Over time, the police would create more power centers for themselves. They would become more powerful. And it is from this that we see the real birthplace of police brutality, where they eventually, right, ultimately, what we have to understand about the police and about policing is that the police are not there to protect the people in the communities that they are in. Not at all. They don't even care often if you are white, or black, or Latino, or Native, or any of a number of other ethnicities. The police care about capital and protecting the means of producing capital, and protecting the capitalist class. That is the function of the police. That is who pays the police. That is why the police were invented. Because wealthy landowners were scared that their ghettos, where they rented out oodles of property and where people were gaining increasing squatters' rights, could be taken from them, could be stolen from them. And they saw that happening right before their very eyes over in Europe, and they saw that happening right before their very eyes in Canada, and they saw that happening right before their very eyes in neighborhoods right next to their own. So the police start as a mafia, essentially, as a way to enforce people to pay their rents, as a way to force people to pay their loans, as a way to force people to pay their leases, as a way to extract capital from the poor workers in these regions, in these areas, these neighborhoods. And so today, the police do all these brutal things. The police kill black transgender women at one of the highest rates of anyone being killed in America. The police kill free poor blacks, yes, but they kill free rich blacks too. And this could be marked as a race line. This could be marked as something happening with, a separation of race as racism. And it is racist, but it is racist only insofar as it is classist. Because ultimately, when the police arrive, they are there to deride and to attack and to destroy the lowest class there, because it is obviously always to them the lowest class causing the problems. This is why rich kids always get away with their crimes, and why poor ones must take the brunt of the burden. So you see, the issue is not singularly the race of the rioter. No, the issue is the class of the rioter. What the liberal media doesn't want you to think about, doesn't want you to realize, is that these are class-based riots. These are mostly very young people. These are mostly students. These are mostly millennials and Zoomers who have not had the opportunity to get the same jobs, who have not had the opportunity to accumulate the same capital, who have not had the opportunity to buy homes, to raise families, to do all these things that the boomers, to do all these things that their parents' generations did and had the luxury of doing here in America. And they could not do them because the boomers have exploited too much. There's not enough capital left to go around. This is one of the contradictions of capital. Always there is more money, and yet always there is less money left in the pot for the poor to reach for. It should be sickening. The greatest thing that we see now is class solidarity. We see many proletarians coming together and buying supplies for one another. They're buying milk, they're buying water, they're buying baking soda. They are contributing to bail funds, which you should be doing. They are showing up in the streets for one another. They are bringing masks. They are helping their brothers escape the police by attacking the police and de-arresting many people. You see, these are all very important forms of praxis, which we have discussed in episode 2. These are all very important examples of solidarity with class, because ultimately it is the class line that we must always follow and must always obey. The media is scared that you would see class, because if you see class, then you would realize that that is the greater divider, and not, as they would have you believe, race, gender, sexuality, etc. The issue, you see, is that many of these people are also what I would call class traitors. Yes, there are class traitors. There are proletarians who work for and who love, perhaps too much, the bourgeois, who are too okay with the bourgeois existing. Often these class traitors work along race lines, yes. But The issue is almost always that these class traders are looked up to, right? Michael Jordan is looked up to. He was poor at one point in his life, I have no doubt, but he is not now. His experience of his blackness now is different than my experience of my blackness now, showing that blackness, showing that race is not simply a function of itself, but is actually a function of class ultimately. Because who in the hell would discriminate against Michael Jordan at a restaurant when they could discriminate against little old me? Who in the hell would discriminate against Oprah at a restaurant when they could discriminate against a little black girl who is there to buy, to sell? And so, because it is a class struggle, we must understand it as such in the material lens. And in the material lens, we must look at the expression of the people. Because, as Martin Luther King said, a riot is the voice of the unheard, the unlistened to, the unloved of society. I'm adding here. So, what about the riot then makes it classist, makes it a function of their class? Well, I will tell you very happily. The riot, you see, is them expressing themselves in the only way that we have been taught how. America has been atomized to the point that you most singularly identify yourself alongside the ideas of a product. Little girls like My Little Pony, that's not me saying that, that's just the assumption of society. That's what My Little Pony was designed to do. It was designed to appeal to a certain demographic of people. Advertising has designed a world wherein we identify ourselves most predominantly by the things that we buy, the things that we sell, and what we do with those things. How long we have them. And because we live in a society that does this, and because we live in a society that relies on you identifying yourself via a product, clearly the most direct way to have your voice heard is through a product. And we see this with the commodification of these riots by imbecilic and impudent brands such as Adidas, Nike, Under Armour, who will appeal along non-class lines, who will appeal along race lines to bourgeois, petty bourgeois, and proletarian alike of a certain race. You know, they will say, "Oh, well, Black Lives Matter. We care." Not enough to allow our workers in Vietnam to unionize, not enough to allow our exploited workers here who ship the things around to our stores, which have yet more exploited workers, not to pay them more, not to give them health care, not to help them in any way. But we care enough to sell you a product that says that we care, that says that you care because you bought our product. It is funny to me that the same people today who would attack rioters for destroying their own communities would in previous years go out and buy Nike products during times like this and then destroy it. They were expressing themselves in the same way and to the same effect, except to different authority figures. Funny how that works. And so you see, the issue is that this is how we identify ourselves in modern America. This is how the lower classes are allowed to talk. It's through buying things. And so when they cannot talk through voice, they must resort to destroying the things that have once shackled them and have at once identified them to the world at large. And it is through doing so that they have learned to create a voice for themselves. And who can blame them? I will leave you today with a quote from the venerable and great Malcolm X. Just as ancient nations paid for their sins against humanity, white America must now pay for her sins against 22 million, quote, Negroes. White America's worst crimes, her hypocrisy and her deceit. White America pretends to ask herself, what do these Negroes want? White America knows that 400 years of cruel bondage has made these 22 million ex-slaves too mentally blind to see what they really want. The white American would hide himself from the reality of his austere and reprehensible oppression by cloaking himself under the veil of my ancestors did it, under the veil of no ethical consumption. But the white American would choose every day not to change the material conditions of his black brother. The white American would choose every day to dig the knife in a little deeper. That is all. Thank you, and enjoy life in the cool